You can spend decades, years being a good daughter, a good son, a good partner, a good parent, professional, and one day wake up with a terrifying question: what if I have become everything except myself? Hello, and welcome back to From the Therapy Room: Psychology of Mind and Body, Understanding How We Think, Feel, Pattern, and Become. I'm your host, Jyoti, a clinical counseling psychotherapist. I'm really glad you're here. You're welcome to follow this space and stay connected. This is a space where we gently explore the inner landscape of the human mind, where psychology meets lived experience and where the stories we carry inside finally find language. In this podcast, we explore the psychology behind everyday emotional experience, the things we often struggle to understand within ourselves. Let's get back to our topic. I want to begin today's episode with a question, though I have already raised the question, but I would like to say it in another way. Not a question to answer quickly, not a question to solve, a question to sit with, a question that may follow up you into your evening walk, your shower room tomorrow morning, or the silence just before sleep. The question is this: are you living your life or are you fulfilling a role? Take a moment. Don't answer immediately. Because most of us have become very good at answering questions from our minds, but this question isn't for the mind. It's for something deeper. It's for the part of you that has been quietly watching your life unfold. The part of you that sometimes whisper, I don't know who I am anymore. Not because you're confused, not because something is wrong with you, but because somewhere along the way the role become larger than the person. You became the good daughter, the responsible son, the devoted parent, the supportive partner, successful professional, therapist, healer, caretaker, the strong one, the dependable one, the one who always understands, the one who never asks for much, and maybe people admire you for it. Maybe people rely on you. Maybe people need you. But beneath all of that, there is another question, a very quieter one. Who are you when nobody needs anything from you? Who are you when there is no role to perform? And who are you when there is nobody to impress, nobody to rescue, nobody to make proud, and nobody to disappoint? Who remains? And if that question feels uncomfortable, you're not alone. Many people spend decades becoming excellent at being needed and almost no time becoming acquainted with ourselves. I think one of the deepest forms of loneliness isn't being alone, it's being surrounded by people who know your role but do not know you. People know you are a mother, the husband, the therapist, the teacher, the leader, the successful one, but they have never met the human being underneath. And perhaps neither have you. Carl Jung spoke about something called persona. The persona is the mask we wear to function in society. No, a mask is not necessarily bad. We need roles, we need identities. Obviously, we need a structure to perform. A therapist cannot walk into a therapy room behaving exactly as they do at home. A person cannot behave exactly as a teenager. A leader cannot behave exactly as a child. Roles matter. The problem begins when the mask becoming so convincing that we forget that it's a mask. We start believing we are the role, and the soul begins disappearing behind it. Carl Jung warned that people often identify so completely with their persona that they lose contact with their deeper nature. The result? A strange emptiness, a quiet depression, an unexplained anxiety, a feeling that something is missing, even when life appears successful. Because success cannot compensate for disconnection from the self. Perhaps this is why so many people arrive in midlife feeling lost, not because they failed, but because they succeeded. They become everything they were supposed to become, and then one day wondering, why doesn't this feel the way I imagined it would? They check every box: education, marriage, children, career, responsibility, recognition, and so on. And yet something inside remains restless. Not because they are ungrateful or selfish or something else, but because the soul has its own agenda. And the soul does not carry very much about social checklists. The soul asks different questions. Questions something like, what have you neglected? What have you abandoned? What part of yourself have you sacrificed so to belong? What dreams have you buried to be accepted? What truth have you swallowed to keep the peace? And many of us learned very early that love was connected to performance, not necessarily because our parent intended harm. Most parents are doing the best they can, but children are extraordinarily sensitive. They learn invisible rules, rules that explicitly teaches, yet they become the operating system of adulthood. A child notices when I'm helpful, people smile. When I'm quiet, there is less conflict. Or when I achieve, people praise me. And when I take care of everyone, I feel important. When I don't need anything, I'm easier to love. And slowly, a rule is born. From authenticity, but from adaptation. Not from freedom, but from survival. And psychodynamically speaking, many adult personalities are actually collections of adaptations. Strategies developed long ago, strategies that once protected us: the people pleaser, the achiever, the caretaker, the perfectionist, the rescuer, the strong one, the peacemaker, and so on. And these identities often begin as intelligent childhood solutions. A child cannot control their environment, but they can control who they become. So they become what the environment rewards, and they carry that role into adulthood. And years later, they may still be performing a script written by a 10-year-old version of themselves without realizing it. Have you ever noticed how exhausting it is to disappoint people? Why? Why does saying no feel so difficult? Why does setting boundaries create guilt? Why does rest feel undeserved? Why does doing something purely because you want to do it feel selfish? The answer may have very little to do with the present and a great deal to do with the past. Because for many people, belonging came before authenticity, connection came before truth, safety came before self expression. And so the nervous system learned, do not risk rejection, do not risk disapproval, do not risk being too much, do not risk being different. The role becomes protection, the role becomes survival, the role becomes identity. And here is where suffering quietly begins. But eventually, the role starts demanding more and more energy. You become exhausted, burned out, emotionally numb, irritable, disconnected, not because you're weak, but because maintaining a false self requires enormous psychological effort. The real self does not require performance, only expression. And there is a profound difference between the two. One is exhausting, the other one is enlivening. One drains energy, the other generates it. One create burns out, the other create vitality. Perhaps as you're listening right now, a role is already appearing in your mind. Maybe the role you have been carrying for years, the role that everyone praises, the role that receive admiration, the role that has become your identity. So a maybe deeper question is emerging. If I stop being this person, who would I be? And that question can feel terrifying, but it also be the beginning of freedom. because every authentic life begins where unconscious performance end. And this is where I want to go about it in so many different way. Most people don't realize that beneath burnout, anxiety, chronic dissatisfaction, emotional numbness, and even some forms of depression, there is often grief. Not obvious grief, the grief because somebody died, but the grief because something inside us never got to live. I wonder how many people arrive in midlife carrying a profound sadness they cannot explain. I know quite a lot of people who are like this. On the surface, life looks fine, sometimes more than fine. Yet underneath there is an ache, a longing, a restlessness, a sense that something essential has been left behind. And often, what has been left behind is the self, the authentic self, the spontaneous self, the curious self, the creative self, the emotional self, the dreamer, the artist, the adventurer, so many things you have become if fear had not been in charge. I want you to imagine something. Imagine two lives, the life you have lived and the life that remain unlived. Most people are very familiar with the first one. They can tell you where they studied, whom they married, what career they choose, what responsibility they carried, but very few people spend time with the second life, the unlived one, the road not taken, the dreams postponed, the words never spoken, the risk never attempted, and the passion abandoned, the boundaries never set, the new tears never cried, the anger never expressed, the truth never relieved. Yet, psychologically speaking, the unlived life never completely disappears. It follows us, not as punishment, but as a whisper, a calling, a longing, a recurring feeling that there is more to us than what has been expressed. And sometimes that whisper becomes louder during transition, a divorce, a retirement, children leaving home, a health scare, a loss, a birthday ending in 0, 30, 40, 50, 60. Moments when life suddenly asks, now that you have spent years becoming who you needed to be, who are you? And this is why so many people experience what we call a midlife crisis. Although I think that phrase is a bit misleading because what looked like crisis is often an awakening that has arrived late, the soul finally refusing to remain silent, the false self beginning to crack, the role become too tight, like a suit that once fit perfectly but now restrict breathing. The tragedy is not that people awaken, the tragedy is that many interpret awakening as failure. They think something must be wrong with me. I should be grateful. I have everything. Why am I unhappy? But perhaps unhappiness is not always pathology. Sometimes it's information too. Sometimes dissatisfaction is the psyche way of saying you have wandered too far from yourself. Let's talk about attachment because this is where many roles are born. When we are children, our deepest need is not success, it's not achievement, it's not a status, it is attachment. We need connection, we need belonging, we need emotional safety, we need caregivers who help us feel seen. And because attachment is so essential to survival, children become extraordinarily adaptive. A child quickly learns what version of me receive loves, what version of me receive approvals, what version of me creates the less conflict. And so different role emerges. Perhaps you become the responsible child, the child who never caused trouble, the child one who matured too quickly, the one who took care of everyone else, and the one who carried burden that never belong to them. People often praise these children. They say she's so mature, he's so responsible, such a good child. But maturity and emotional burden are not always the same thing. Sometimes what's look like maturity is actually adaptation. A child becoming who they need to become to preserve connection became the achiever. Maybe love felt most available when you succeeded, when you scored well, when you performed. And so achievement become your identity. But here's the painful paradox. No achievement can permanently heal a wound that originated in belonging. Because the wound is not, am I successful enough? The wound is, am I lovable without performing? Those are two different questions. And many adults spends decade answering the wrong one. Perhaps you became the caretaker, the emotional manager, the ones who sensed everybody's moods, the one who knew when someone was upset before they spoke, the one who learned to prioritize others. And as an adult, you may find yourself exhausted, not because you don't care, but because you have never learned where your responsibilities end. You feel guilty when others suffer. You feel guilty when you rest. You feel guilty when you choose yourself. And deep down, there may be an unconscious fear: if I stop taking care of everyone, will people still love me? Notice how many of our adult struggles are actually attachment questions wearing different roles. Often ask, am I worthy if I'm imperfect? People pleasing task. Will I be abandoned if I disappoint someone? Workaholism asks, can I rest and still matter? Tendencies asks, who am I if I'm not needed? In other words, what I'm trying to say that there are so many masks and there are so many questions behind them. Each one of them are valid, because the mask that once protected you may eventually suffocate you. I think here is the profound wisdom in that. Because the very adaptation that once helped us survive can become obstacle to becoming fully alive, not because they were wrong, not because they were unhealthy, not because we should be ashamed of them. They were intelligent, necessary, protective, but survival and aliveness are not the same thing. At some point, life asks us to move beyond survival, to stop asking, what must I do to be accepted, and begin asking, what is true, what is real, what is mine, what belongs to me, what belongs to other, who am I beneath all of this? And that is where the real journey began, not the journey toward becoming someone else, but the journey toward recovering the person who was always there beneath the role. Most people do not fear failure nearly as much as they fear authenticity. We think we are afraid of failing. We think we are afraid of making mistake. We think we are afraid of rejection. But if we look deeply enough underneath all of those fear, fears often lies something even more fundamental: the fear of becoming visible, the fear of becoming real, the fear of becoming ourselves. Because the moment we begin living authentically, we inevitably disrupt expectations. And expectations are often the invisible glue holding a relationship together. Think about it. Every relationship contains conscious agreement and unconscious agreement. The conscious agreement are obvious, and the unconscious agreement are much more powerful. They sound something like this: you remain the responsible one, you remain the caretaker, you remain the peacemaker, you remain the strong one, and so on. And as long as you fulfill the contract, the system remains solid. But the moment you begin changing, the system becomes uncomfortable. Not because people are bad, not because they don't love you, but because every system resists change. Even healthy system do, and family system especially do. And this is why growth often feels lonely, not because growth itself is lonely, but because growth frequently requires renegotiating old identities. Imagine someone who has spent 40 years pleasing everyone, and one day they begin saying no. Objectively, this sounds healthy, but psychologically, it can feel terrifying because the nervous system interprets authenticity as danger. The body remembers every moment when self expression threatened connection, every moment when honesty led to criticism, every moment when disagreement led to withdrawal, and every moment when individuality led to shame. And so, even decades later, authenticity can trigger anxiety, not because it is wrong, but because it feels unfamiliar. This is one of the great paradox of healing. People often imagine healing will feel comfortable, but healing frequently feels uncomfortable at first. But because healing is not merely feeling better, healing is becoming more truthful, and truth can be disruptive. Imagine a woman who has spent her entire life being the good daughter, always available, always accommodating, always sacrificing, always putting herself last. One day she decides she needs boundaries. Perhaps she stops answering every call immediately. Perhaps she chose rest over obligation. Perhaps she'll say, I can't do that this weekend. For many people, this sounds simple, but for her, it may feel like betrayal. Not because she is doing something wrong, but because her identity has become intertwined with sacrifice. She no longer knows where love ends and self abandonment. This brings us to a profoundly important psychological idea. Donald Winnicott called it as the false self. Winnicott believed that many people develop a self organized around adaptation, a self that learns what do others need from me, what version of me receives approval, what version of me is safest. Over time, the adaptation self becomes dominant. It becomes automatic, it becomes convincing, it becomes successful, but underneath it remains the true self, the spontaneous self, the alive self, the authentic self, the self that experiences joy naturally, the self that creates, the self that feels deeply, the self that has not disappeared, only gone underground. And often the symptoms that bring people into therapy are not signs that something is broken, they are the signs that the true self is knocking on the door. Anxiety, burned out, restlessness, chronic dissatisfaction, a feeling of emptiness, a loss of meaning. Sometimes these are not enemies, sometimes they are invitation. The psyche has an extraordinary intelligence. When we ignore ourselves for too long, something eventually begins protesting. Perhaps through exhaustion, perhaps through depression, through anxiety, through a crisis, because psyche says, I cannot continue carrying this burden. I cannot continue pretending. I cannot living someone else's life. And because we live in a culture obsessed with productivity, we often interpret these signals incorrectly. We ask, how do I get rid of these feelings? Instead of asking, what is the feeling? What is this feeling trying to tell me? Because Jung would probably invite us to look toward the shadow. The shadow is not evil. The shadow is everything we learned was unacceptable, everything we pushed away, everything we disowned, not because it was bad, but because it threatened belonging. Perhaps your anger lives in the shadow. Perhaps your anger wasn't allowed. Perhaps your ambition lives in shadow because ambition threatened only family expectations. Because perhaps your sensitivity lives in the shadow because vulnerability felt unsafe. Often contains not only what is dark but also what is alive. Many people spend years trying to become better when what they actually need to become whole. There is a difference. Becoming better often means perfecting the persona, and becoming whole means recovering the part of yourself you abandoned. The people pleaser learns healthy selfishness. Perfectionist learns imperfection. The strong one learns vulnerability. The caretaker learns receiving. The responsible one learns play. Wholeness is not becoming someone new. Wholeness is reclaiming what was lost. Speak something directly to the listener who may be realizing something difficult. Maybe you have built a life around a role that once made sense, that has protected you, that has helped you to survive, and now you feel trapped inside it. If that is true, I want to hear something very important here. The goal is not to destroy the role, the goal is not to reject the responsibility or to abandon your commitment, but psychologically, maturity is not choosing authenticity over responsibility, it is learning to hold both. The healthiest parent still remains a parent. The healthiest therapist still remains a therapist. The healthiest partner still remains a partner. The difference is that the role no longer consumes the person. The role becomes something you do, not something you are. There is an enormous freedom in that distinction. When the role becomes your identity, every threat to the role becomes a threat to your existence. But when the role becomes one expression of who you are, life becomes more spacious, more flexible, more human. You can fail without collapsing. You can disappear without disintegrating. You can change without feeling guilty. You can evolve without feeling disloyal. And perhaps that is the one of the deepest tasks of the adulthood, to remain connected to others without abandoning yourself, to love without disappearing, to care without carrying everyone, to belong without betraying your truth. We need to discuss one of the most important thing, perhaps a kind of obstacle, and perhaps the most powerful obstacle of all is guilt. The guilt that emerges whenever we begin choosing ourselves. The guilt that says you're selfish, you're disappointing people, you're becoming someone they won't recognize, you're abandoning your responsibility. For many people, guilt is the final chain connecting them to old identity. What we call guilt is actually for the person we can no longer continue pretending to be, and the and grief for the life that is asking to emerge. You to notice something, not with your mind, not with analysis, just quietly notice what has been happening inside you as you have listened. Perhaps a memory surfaced, perhaps a sadness, perhaps a longing, perhaps a question you have been avoiding for years. Because when we begin talking about roles, we are never really talking about roles, we are talking about identity. We're talking about belonging, we're talking about love, and ultimately, we're talking about the relationship we have with ourselves. I want to talk now about the guilt because for many people, guilt becomes the invisible prison that keeps them trapped inside old identities. Have you ever noticed how quickly guilt appears when you choose yourself? You finally set a boundary and guilt appears. You decline an invitation and guilt appears. You decide to rest and guilt appears. You stop rescuing someone and guilt appears. You begin pursuing your dream and guilt appears. Why? Why does caring for yourself something feel wrong? Why does honoring your need feels sometimes feel selfish? Because for many people, guilt is not actually about morality, it is about conditioning. The psyche learned something long ago. It learned if I upset people, I may lose connection. If I prioritize myself, I may be rejected. If I stop performing my role, I may stop being loved. And so guilt become an alarm system, not necessarily indicating wrongdoing, but indicating departure from an old identity. This is one of the most important distinction we can learn. Not all guilt is wisdom. Some guilt is simply conditioning, protesting change. Some guilt is the voice of old survival strategies. Some guilt is the voice of a frightened younger self trying to keep you safe. And when you begin growing, that younger self often become anxious. Imagine a child inside you, a child who has spent years believing, I must be good, I must be useful, I must not disappoint my parent and my friend and other people, I must take care of everyone. The child is not trying to sabotage you, this child is trying to protect you. The problem is that the child is still operating with outdated information. The child believes authenticity is dangerous. The adult knows authenticity is necessary. And healing often involves helping those two parts meet. This is why self compassion is so important. Not because self compassion feels nice, but because transformation without compassion often becomes violence. Many people discover their pattern and immediately attack themselves. They say, I have been people pleasing my whole life. I have wasted years. I have betrayed myself. I have lived for everyone else. And then they begin judging themselves. But think about this, the role was never your enemy. The role protected you. The role helped you to survive. That role helped you belong and helped you navigate difficult circumstances. The role deserves some gratitude, not condemnation. Because every adaptation was an attempt to receive love, safety, or connection. The question is not why did I become this way? The deeper question is, do I still need this strategy today? Carl Jung called the second half of life the process of individuation. And I think this is one of the most beautiful psychological ideas ever offered. Individuation is not becoming special, it's not becoming superior or enlightened. It is becoming yourself fully, honestly, courageously. It is a gradual integration of all the parts you have rejected, abandoned, hidden, or forgotten. Strong and the vulnerable, the responsible and the playful, the caring and the self protective, the spiritual and the human, the masculine and the feminine, the achiever and the dreamer, the visible and the hidden. Individuation is not perfection, it is wholeness. And perhaps this is why so many people experience profound shift in midlife, not because they are falling apart, but because the psyche is trying to become whole. The the first half of life often asks, how do I belong? The second half often asks, who am I? The first half asks, how do I succeed? The second half asks, what is meaningful? The first half asks, what do others expect? And the second half asks, what is true? These are very different questions, and many people spend years answering the first set before realizing the second set even exists. We can look at it from the spiritual dimension too. What I have observed and what I have read otherwise, across many traditions, there is a recurring idea. The idea that beneath our identity exists something deeper, a presence and essence. The self that is untouched by rules, untouched by achievement, untouched by failure, by social status, approval, criticism, a deeper self, a witnessing self, the part of you that has been present through every age and every chapter. The child, the adolescent, the adult, the parent, the professional, the partner, the caregiver, the achiever, all of those identities have changed, yet something has remained constant. Something has been watching. Something has been experiencing. Something has remained quietly present. And perhaps genuine healing involves returning to that place. Because if your identity depends entirely upon your role, what happens when the role disappears? Children grow up, career ends, relationship change, bodies age, titles vanish, success fluctuate. life changes. And if your entire identity is built upon what you do, then every transition feels like annihilation. But if your identity is rooted in something deeper, then change becomes less threatening because you understand, I'm more than this role. I'm more than this title. I'm more than this achievement. I'm more than this responsibility. I am more than what I provide. I'm more than what I accomplish. And I'm more than what others think of me. And perhaps this brings us back to the question which we began: are you living your life or are you fulfilling the role? Notice that this is not an either or question because healthy living includes roles. The goal is not to escape them, the goal is to inhabit them consciously. To remember that you are the actor, not the costume, the soul. You are the soul, not the mask. You are the person, not the performance. Maybe you are a parent, but you are not only a parent. Maybe you're a therapist, but you're not only a therapist. Maybe you are a partner, but you're not only a partner. Maybe you're needed, but your worth is not dependent on being needed. And maybe for the very first time in a very long time, you're being invited to ask, what do I want? What brings me alive? What feels true? What am I pretending not to know? What parts of me is waiting to be reclaimed? Before before we close, I want to leave with your reflection. Imagine you are 90 years old. You're sitting quietly, looking back on your life. The noise has faded, the expectations have faded, the comparisons have faded, the pressure has faded, and from that place you're looking back. What would make you proud? Not impressed, proud. Would it be how perfectly you fulfilled every role? Or would it be that somewhere along the way you found the courage to become yourself? Not perfectly, not dramatically, not at all once, but honestly, little by little, year by year, choice by choice, boundary by boundary, truth by truth, until eventually the distance between who you are and who you appear to be become smaller and smaller, until one day there was no role left to hide behind, only you, whole, human, imperfect, alive. And perhaps that is what freedom really is: not the absence of responsibility, not the absence of commitment, not the absence of roles, but the ability to carry your roles without losing yourself inside them, to love deeply without abandoning yourself, to belong without betraying yourself, to serve without disappearing, to care without carrying everyone, to give without emptying yourself, and to remember again and again throughout the changing seasons of life, you are more than the role you play. You always have been, and you always will be. It comes from finally understanding yourself. This has been from the Therapy Room, Psychology of Mind and Body. If this resonates with you, you can share what you felt or noticed. I would love to hear your reflections. And if you find these conversations meaningful, if this conversation feels like it was speaking directly to your mind, please share this episode with someone who might quietly needed it, because so many people live inside this pattern silently. And if you enjoy psychologically deep therapy room style conversation around healing relationship, trauma, anxiety, attachment, and emotional well being, follow the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. I'll meet you in the next conversation. Take gentle care. Until next time, take care of your mind, your body, and the quiet spaces within you. See you. I'll be sitting just next besides to you. Take care.